Imagine standing at the edge of time, peering into the footprints our ancestors left behind. Across ancient riverbeds and beneath the earth of long-forgotten campsites, the bones uncovered tell a story not of pastoral peace, but of wounds inflicted by arrows, clubs, and the desperate will to survive. These marks are the earliest chapters of a tale that stretches unbroken to this moment. The story of why we insist on creating enemies, why the impulse to fight clings to us like shadow, and why, even when the cannons lie silent, we fashion battlegrounds in offices, online forums, and our own hearts. From the first farmers carving ditches around their fields, to the generals marshaling digital armies on social media, conflict has been woven into our very fabric. Archaeologist Lawrence Keeley shattered the myth of the primordial idol, showing that prehistoric peoples buried more of their own dead by violence than modern societies do in a century of world wars. Fortified villages and stockades were never mere ornaments. They were born of collective anxiety, of the ever-present fear that the stranger approaching the palisade carried a spear, not a gift. When tribes fought not for territory alone, but to prevent the rise of tyrants among them, they harnessed war as a social thermostat, an agon that kept ambition in check by redirecting it outward. Countless cultures channeled aggression into raiding parties that returned home bearing captives, not to enslave, but to dilute concentration of power. In these paradoxes lies our earliest truth. Conflict is at once destructive and, in its own twisted way, necessary. Moving forward through centuries, the same pattern repeats. Philosophers gave voice to the tension ringing inside us. Hobbes sketched a world where every man's hand was turned against his neighbor, and peace itself was a fragile covenant, upheld only by the looming threat of Leviathan's wrath. Rousseau countered with a vision of natural harmony corrupted by property and power. Yet even he admitted that once the taste for domination awakens, it never fully sleeps. Freud buried the impulse deeper still, coaxing out the death drive hidden alongside Eros, a subterranean hunger that civilization could only partially contain. Those desultory impulses, when left to fester unexamined, erupt like dormant volcanoes, shaping the course of history in ash and ruin. Yet the physical devastation of war is only the surface. Dive beneath, and you find a current of projection, a psychological alchemy by which we cast our darkest aspects onto others. Jung named it the shadow, the repository of everything we deny in ourselves, our envy, our fear, our longing to dominate. When a society refuses to look at its own ugliness, it sees that ugliness mirrored in the neighbor beyond its borders. The enemy is not an objective threat, but a psychic refugee camp where we exile what we dare not integrate. Propaganda fizzes with these projections, painting entire peoples as vermin, as existential scourges that must be contained or erased. From ancient songs that celebrated the triumph over barbarian hordes, to the chilling efficiency of modern hate campaigns. What changes is the medium, not the message. Televised rallies give way to viral tweets, but the story remains one of moral panic, of drawing lines in the sand and hurling insults like stones. When fear mounts, whether of economic collapse, cultural displacement, or an unseen virus, people crave a scapegoat. It might be a political rival, a religious minority, or even a technological innovation blamed for ruining society. The scapegoat absorbs the anxieties too painful to acknowledge, and the collective heartbeat steadies as long as it can run on someone else's blood. Yet the same mechanisms that pit nations against each other also sting in our daily lives. A harsh word in a meeting, a curt email from a neighbor, a heated comment thread, each becomes an arena where we fight for status, for validation, for the right to be seen as good and just. The self-appointed arbiter of morality wields judgment like a sword, slicing at anyone who dares hold a differing view. Social media's algorithms are complicit architects, amplifying outrage, rewarding the crude binaries of friend and foe. Before long, civility crumbles, replaced by a theater of accusation where nuance goes to die. But there is another story woven alongside these darker currents, one of awakening and choice. Because if conflict springs from the unconscious, then bringing it into the light can loosen its grip. Every moment of honest introspection is an act of rebellion against the tide of projection. When we pause and ask ourselves why we bristle at opposing opinions, when we feel the sting of envy or the rise of contempt, we catch a glimpse of that shadow within. Naming it, owning it, permits it to transform. The truths of our inner world ripple outward. A conversation that begins in defensiveness can, with a single question asked in genuine curiosity, shift toward empathy. The coworker whose email felt like an ambush may simply be wrestling with their own anxieties. The stranger on the street may bear burdens we cannot see. Recognizing this does not erase conflict. It reframes it as an invitation to understanding rather than a license for destruction. On a broader scale, we see echoes of this in movements that reclaim narrative from the jaws of hostility. Communities rebuilding after sectarian violence find ways to commemorate the past without enshrining it as eternal hatred. Schools teaching peace studies combine history's harsh lessons with practices of active listening and restorative justice, sowing seeds of empathy in generations that will grow in a world still too eager for division. Artists and storytellers craft tales that celebrate complexity over caricature, that invite audiences to sit with contradictions instead of choosing sides. These are small revolutions against the gravitational pull of enmity. None promise utopia. Humans will likely spar as long as we carry desires and fears. But every act of self-awareness is a fortress built against the siege of unconscious impulses. Every dialogue that honors the other's dignity is a trench dug into the ground of our own prejudice. Perhaps the most radical step is simply this: to recognize that the war we wage outside mirrors the civil war within. When you feel the impulse to hate, to vilify, to silence, pause and ask what part of yourself it hides. When you meet it with attention rather than spurn it, you begin to transform not only your own heart, but the world you inhabit. Conflict then ceases to be an inevitable fate and becomes a signal, an alarm that points to shadows demanding integration. In that light, the question shifts from why we fight to how we choose to respond. The warrior becomes the witness, the battlefield a classroom. And in that classroom, each of us holds the power to change the lesson. The greatest victory lies not in defeating another, but in recognizing the battles we wage within. When the drumbeats of judgment rise, we can choose to soften our stance, to listen beneath the roar, and discover the fears and hopes that bind us all. Each moment of compassion, each willingness to hold tension without lashing out, becomes a bridge across the chasm we once feared. In the silent space beyond accusation, we find a different rhythm, a shared heartbeat that reminds us of our common humanity. It is here, in the gentle surrender of me versus you, that war loses its power and dialogue blooms in its place. Let this be the answer we carry with us, not to vanquish the enemy, but to welcome our own shadows home, turning weapons into tools for understanding and turning conflict into the spark that illuminates connection. In that transformation, true peace begins its story.